I stood outside the courthouse holding the deed to my $6 million beach villa, watching my own parents walk up the steps with their attorney to sue me for it. They wanted to give my home to my sister Sarah, claiming I had stolen what rightfully belonged to her. 3 months of legal warfare had led to this moment. I had no lawyer, no backup plan, just the truth and a stack of documents they had never seen. Today, everything would change forever. 6 years earlier, I was sleeping on my friend Marcus's couch in a cramped studio apartment in Venice Beach, surviving on instant ramen and determination. My name is Arlo, and at 28, I was just another failed startup founder with big dreams and an empty bank account. The cybersecurity app I'd been developing for 3 years had eaten through my savings, my credit cards, and most of my relationships. Every morning I'd wake up before sunrise and walk to the local coffee shop where they had free Wi-Fi, nursing a single black coffee for hours, while coding furiously on my ancient laptop. The other customers would give me dirty looks as I monopolized a table, but I had nowhere else to go. My parents, Linda and Frank, lived 40 minutes away in their modest Torrance home, but calling them for help meant enduring another lecture about my poor life choices. "You could have been a teacher like your mother," Frank would say, during our rare phone conversations, his voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment. "Steady paycheck, good benefits, respect in the community. Instead, you're chasing these computer fantasies that'll never amount to anything." Linda was worse. She'd perfected the art of passive-aggressive concern, always mentioning how my sister Sarah was struggling with her art career. But at least she was pursuing something meaningful. "Your sister creates beauty in this world, Arlo. What exactly are you contributing with all those computer codes and numbers?" Sarah, 2 years older than me, had always been the family favorite. While I spent high school buried in programming books and computer science courses, she was the creative one, painting watercolor landscapes and writing poetry that made Linda cry with pride. When Sarah graduated with a fine arts degree, our parents celebrated for weeks. When I got accepted into MIT's computer science program, they asked if I was sure I wouldn't rather study something more practical. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning in March. I was debugging my app's encryption protocols when my phone exploded with notifications. DataCorp, one of the largest financial services companies in California, had just suffered a massive attempted cyber attack. Their entire customer database, containing personal information for over 2 million clients, had been targeted by hackers trying to steal everything from social security numbers to banking credentials. The attack failed because DataCorp had been running a beta version of my cybersecurity app as part of their trial period. My software had detected the intrusion attempt in real time, automatically isolating the compromised servers and preventing any data theft. Within hours, DataCorp's CEO was calling me personally. "Mr. Torres," he said, his voice shaking with relief and excitement, "your program just saved us from the biggest security disaster in our company's history. We need to talk immediately." The meeting took place in DataCorp's downtown Los Angeles headquarters the next day. I borrowed a decent shirt from Marcus and took 3 buses to get there, clutching my laptop bag like it contained the crown jewels. The boardroom was intimidating, filled with executives in $1,000 suits, discussing numbers that made my head spin. "We want to acquire your software," the CEO announced after a brief presentation about the attack. "Full buyout, complete ownership transfer, and we'd like you to head up our new cybersecurity division." The number they offered made me physically dizzy. $12 million, $4 million upfront, $8 million in structured payments over 2 years, plus a salary of $200,000 annually to run their security department. I tried to maintain my composure, but my hands were shaking as I signed the preliminary agreement. Marcus screamed so loud when I called him that his neighbors complained to the building manager. That night, we celebrated at the fanciest restaurant in Santa Monica, where I ordered a steak that cost more than I'd spent on food in the previous month. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The first thing I did was pay off every debt I'd accumulated during the lean years. Student loans, credit cards, money I'd borrowed from friends. Everything got cleared within a week. The second thing was finding my own place. After 3 years of couch surfing and shared apartments, I wanted space privacy and a view that reminded me how far I'd come. That's when I found the villa in Malibu. The real estate agent, a polished woman named Catherine who drove a Tesla and wore jewelry worth more than my old annual salary, showed me a dozen properties before we arrived at the glass and steel masterpiece perched on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The house was 5,000 square feet of modern architecture with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the ocean and an infinity pool that seemed to blend into the horizon. So, the previous owner was a music producer. Catherine explained as we toured the 3 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms. He spared no expense on the finishes. Italian marble countertops, German appliances, a home theater system that cost more than most people's cars. Standing on the main deck watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink while waves crashed against the rocks below, I knew this was home. The price was steep, $6 million. But I could afford $4 million in cash and qualify for a mortgage on the remaining $2 million. I'll take it, I told Catherine, who tried to hide her surprise at such a quick decision. The paperwork took 6 weeks to finalize. During that time, I barely slept, terrified that something would go wrong and I'd lose this chance at the life I'd always dreamed of. When I finally got the keys and walked into my own home for the first time, I called my parents to share the good news. "You bought what?" Linda's voice was sharp with disbelief. "A house in Malibu, Mom, right on the beach. It's incredible. You and Dad should come see it this weekend." The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Frank's voice came through, measured and cold. $6 million for a house, Arlo. That's more money than your mother and I will see in our entire lifetime. I hope you're proud of yourself. I worked hard for this, Dad. I thought you'd be happy that I finally made something of myself." "Then made something of yourself?" Linda's laugh was bitter. "You mean you got lucky with some computer program? Meanwhile, your sister can barely afford groceries, but she's out there creating real art, contributing something meaningful to society." The conversation ended with them declining my invitation to visit. I hung up feeling deflated, but Marcus helped me put it in perspective during our housewarming party 2 months later. "Your parents don't understand what you've accomplished," he said as we stood on the deck watching the sunset. "They can't see past their own limitations to appreciate your success." The party was perfect. 50 people from my new job, old friends, from the startup community, and neighbors from the Cliffside community who welcomed me warmly. The caterers served fresh seafood and California wines, while a jazz trio played soft music that mixed beautifully with the sound of the ocean. I was feeling genuinely happy for the first time in years when I stepped onto the side balcony for some air and heard familiar voices drifting from around the corner. My parents had arrived late and were talking to Sarah in hushed tones, unaware that their voices carried in the ocean breeze. "This is ridiculous," Linda was saying. "Look at this place, Frank. Look at what he's living in while Sarah can't even afford a decent studio apartment." "It's not right," Frank agreed. "All this money, all this space, and he's here alone. Sarah could have a real art studio in a place like this. She could actually focus on her work without worrying about rent every month." "Don't worry, honey." Linda's voice took on that manipulative tone I remembered from childhood arguments. "We'll find a way to get you this house. Arlo owes us for everything we've done for him over the years. This place should be yours." Sarah's response made my stomach turn. "You really think there's a way? I mean, I've always dreamed of having a space like this for my art. The light here is perfect, and the inspiration from the ocean view." "Trust us," Frank said firmly. "This house should be in the family, available to the person who needs it most, and that person is definitely you." I stood frozen on that balcony, listening to my own family plot against me at my own housewarming party. The success I'd worked so hard to achieve, the home I'd finally earned through years of struggle and sacrifice, they saw it as something that should be redistributed, according to their sense of fairness. The betrayal cut deeper than any business failure or romantic disappointment I'd ever experienced. That night, after everyone left and I was alone in my beautiful home overlooking the Pacific, I realized that my biggest challenge wasn't going to be maintaining my success or growing my career. It was going to be protecting what I'd built from the people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally. The campaign began subtly the way all effective manipulation does. At first, it seemed like normal family concern disguised as casual conversation. Linda would call every few weeks ostensibly to check on my well-being. But the conversations always circled back to Sarah's struggles and my abundance. "Your sister had to choose between groceries and art supplies again this week," she'd say with a heavy sigh. "I wish there was some way she could have a stable place to work on her paintings. Somewhere with good light and space to really spread out her canvases." Frank's approach was more direct but equally calculated. During our monthly family dinners at their Torrance home, he'd make comments about the villa being too much house for one person and how families should share their blessings. He'd describe it as fiscal responsibility, arguing that I could rent out rooms or let Sarah stay there while I traveled for business. Right? That guest bedroom with the ocean view would make a perfect art studio, he'd mention while passing the potatoes. Sarah could house sit when you're away on those business trips to San Francisco. Win-win situation for everyone. Sarah herself became increasingly vocal about the disparity in our circumstances. During these family gatherings, she'd regale us with stories of her latest financial crisis, the gallery that couldn't pay her for a commission piece, the art supply store that cut off her credit, the landlord threatening eviction from her cramped studio apartment in Hollywood. "I had to sell 3 paintings just to make rent this month," she announced during Sunday dinner in October, "and even then I'm eating ramen every night. Meanwhile, Arlo's probably throwing dinner parties for tech executives in that mansion." "It's not a mansion," I protested mildly, trying to keep the peace, "and I worked 18-hour days for 3 years to afford it." Some people have all the luck," Sarah muttered, stabbing at her meatloaf with unnecessary force. The guilt campaign intensified as winter approached. Linda began sending me articles about successful people who'd lost touch with their families, stories about tech entrepreneurs who'd forgotten their roots and ended up isolated and miserable. Frank started making pointed comments about how my success had changed me, claiming I was becoming cold and materialistic. "Remember when you used to call every week?" Linda asked during one particularly painful phone conversation. "Now we're lucky if we hear from you once a month. I guess when you're living in luxury, family becomes less important." The truth was, I'd been avoiding their calls because every conversation left me feeling manipulated and guilty. I loved my family, but their constant pressure was exhausting. Every achievement felt diminished by their resentment, every moment of happiness shadowed by their disapproval. By Christmas, Sarah's situation had deteriorated further. She'd been evicted from her apartment and moved back into her childhood bedroom at Linda and Frank's house. At 32 years old, she was sleeping in the same twin bed she'd occupied during high school, her art supplies crammed into boxes stacked against the walls. "What? This is temporary," she insisted when I visited for Christmas dinner, but her eyes held a desperate quality that made me genuinely worried. "I'm just regrouping, figuring out my next move. Some artists don't find their breakthrough until their 40s. Linda seized every opportunity to highlight the contrast between Sarah's circumstances and mine. "Your sister could really use some stability right now," she'd say while we opened presents. "Just a quiet place where she could focus on her work without worrying about rent or roommates or landlords." "Maybe I could help her find a decent apartment," I offered, but Frank shook his head dismissively. "Throwing money at the problem isn't the solution, son. What Sarah needs is family support, not charity. She needs to know that her own brother cares enough to share his good fortune." The pressure intensified after the holidays. Linda began calling twice a week, always with updates about Sarah's emotional state. According to our mother, Sarah was slipping into depression, struggling with feelings of worthlessness and artistic inadequacy. The lack of proper studio space was crushing her creativity, stifling her potential for the breakthrough that was surely just around the corner. "She's so talented, Arlo," Linda would plead. "If she just had the right environment, the right support system, she could really flourish. You could give her that chance." Frank's approach became more aggressive. During a particularly uncomfortable phone conversation in February, he accused me of hoarding resources while watching my sister suffer. "You've got 4 bedrooms and you're using 1. You've got studio space that's sitting empty while Sarah's cramped into a childhood bedroom. What kind of brother does that make you?" The breaking point came in March when they orchestrated what they called a family emergency. Linda called me at work, sobbing hysterically, claiming that Sarah had collapsed and needed immediate medical attention. The emergency room bills would be catastrophic without proper insurance, and they needed me to co-sign for a $50,000 medical loan to cover the costs. I rushed to the hospital, my heart pounding with genuine fear for my sister's well-being. I found Sarah in a private recovery room, looking pale but alert, with Linda holding her hand and Frank pacing nervously by the window. "What happened?" I asked, still breathless from running through the hospital corridors. "Exhaustion and stress," Linda explained tearfully. "The doctor says she's been pushing herself too hard, not eating properly, not sleeping enough. All this pressure to succeed as an artist while living in such cramped conditions. It's been too much for her system." The medical loan paperwork was already prepared, waiting for my signature on the bedside table. Frank handed me a pen with an expression of earnest desperation. "We wouldn't ask if there was any other option, son. But with Sarah's health at stake," I signed without reading the details, focused entirely on my sister's recovery. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that Marcus mentioned seeing Sarah at a Beverly Hills plastic surgery clinic looking remarkably healthy for someone who'd recently suffered a stress-related collapse. The investigation I conducted through a private medical records search revealed the devastating truth. The $50,000 had paid for a complete cosmetic surgery package, breast augmentation rhinoplasty, and facial rejuvenation procedures. The emergency had been entirely fabricated, a performance designed to manipulate my protective instincts and extract money for Sarah's elective surgeries. When I confronted Linda about the deception, her response was chillingly casual. "Sarah needed those procedures for her self-confidence," she said without a trace of shame. "An artist's appearance affects how galleries and collectors perceive her work. We were investing in her future success. You lied to me about a medical emergency to steal $50,000? I replied, my voice shaking with betrayal and rage. "We didn't steal anything, your family. You should want to help Sarah achieve her potential. The money will come back to you when she becomes successful." The conversation ended with Linda hanging up on me when I demanded repayment. Frank called back an hour later, but instead of apologizing, he lectured me about my materialistic attitude and lack of family loyalty. According to him, my refusal to freely share my wealth with Sarah demonstrated how success had corrupted my values. Over the following months, I began to notice a pattern of alienation spreading through our extended family. Cousins who'd always been friendly became distant during family gatherings. Aunts and uncles made pointed comments about my changed personality and newfound arrogance. Linda and Frank had been systematically poisoning my relationships, painting me as a selfish success story who'd abandoned his struggling family. The isolation was deliberate and effective. By summer, most family gatherings felt like interventions designed to shame me into giving Sarah access to the villa. The message was consistent across all relatives. I had more than I needed. Sarah was suffering unfairly, and true family loyalty demanded sacrifice for the greater good. The final straw came in August, when I returned from a business trip to Seattle and found evidence that someone had been staying in my house. The security system hadn't been triggered, which meant whoever had gained access knew the alarm codes. Small things were out of place. A coffee mug and the wrong cabinet towels folded differently than I'd left them. The guest bed rumpled, despite my having washed the sheets before leaving. I installed hidden security cameras throughout the house the next week, focusing on entrances and common areas. What I discovered over the following month made me physically sick with betrayal and violated trust. Sarah had been using my spare key to bring dates to the villa while I traveled for business. The footage showed her giving tours to various men, describing the house as the family place and acting as though she had every right to be there. She'd been hosting intimate dinners on my deck, using my expensive wine collection to impress her romantic interests, and sleeping in my guest rooms with strangers. One particularly painful video showed her standing in my living room, gesturing toward the ocean view while explaining to a date, "My brother lets me use this place whenever I need space to work on my art. He's never here anyway, always traveling for business, so it's basically mine most of the time." Watching my sister treat my home like her personal resort, while simultaneously portraying herself as a victim of my selfishness, was a betrayal that cut deeper than the financial manipulation or family alienation. She wasn't just taking advantage of my generosity, she was rewriting reality to justify her sense of entitlement to everything I'd worked to achieve. The evidence was clear, documented, and undeniable. But I knew that confronting Sarah directly would result in another round of family-wide manipulation and guilt campaigns. I needed a different strategy, something that would expose the truth and protect my property without destroying what remained of our family relationships. What I didn't realize was that Linda and Frank were already planning their next move, one that would escalate our conflict far beyond family drama into the realm of legal warfare. They'd been consulting with attorneys, researching property law, and developing a case that would make their previous manipulations look like minor disagreements. The war was about to begin, and I was completely unprepared for the lengths they were willing to go to take everything I'd built. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday evening in September. I'd been planning it for weeks, rehearsing different approaches, trying to find a way to address Sarah's unauthorized use of my house without completely destroying our relationship. The security footage was saved on my laptop, undeniable evidence of her repeated violations of my trust and privacy. I drove to my parents' house in Torrance, just after 6 o'clock, knowing that Sarah would be there for their traditional family dinner. Linda answered the door with her usual forced smile, the kind that never reached her eyes when she was annoyed about something. "Arlo, what a surprise. We weren't expecting you tonight." "I need to talk to all of you about something important," I said, stepping into the familiar living room where Frank was watching the news and Sarah was curled up on the couch with a sketch pad. The conversation started calmly enough. I explained that I'd noticed signs someone had been in my house during my recent travels, and I'd installed security cameras to investigate. Sarah's face went pale immediately, but she maintained her composure better than I'd expected. "The cameras recorded you bringing multiple people to my house over the past month," I said, keeping my voice steady and factual. "You've been using my home like it's your own personal vacation rental." Sarah's response was immediate tears, the same defense mechanism she'd used since childhood whenever caught doing something wrong. "I thought you wouldn't mind," she sobbed. "You're never there anyway, and I just needed a quiet place to think about my art. I wasn't hurting anything." Frank stood up from his chair, his face flushing with indignation. "You've been spying on your own sister, installing secret cameras to catch her in some imaginary wrongdoing." "It's not imaginary, Dad. I have video evidence of her bringing strangers into my house and telling them it's the family property. She's been treating it like she owns the place." Linda moved to comfort Sarah, wrapping protective arms around her while glaring at me with pure maternal fury. "Your sister has been struggling, Arlo. She needed a peaceful environment to work on her paintings. Instead of supporting her during this difficult time, you've been treating her like a criminal. She used my house without permission, brought strangers there without my knowledge, and lied about it to everyone she brought. That's not support. That's theft and trespassing." "Theft," Sarah's voice rose to a wail. I'm your sister. I thought family was supposed to share everything. I thought you cared about me. The argument escalated quickly from there. Frank accused me of becoming paranoid and controlling, obsessed with material possessions at the expense of family relationships. Linda claimed that my success had made me cold and suspicious, unable to trust the people who loved me most. Sarah continued crying, insisting that she'd only been trying to find inspiration for her art in a beautiful environment. You have this incredible house sitting empty most of the time, she pleaded through her tears. I just wanted to feel connected to something beautiful, something that reminded me that success is possible. Was that really so wrong? What's wrong is lying about it, I replied. What's wrong is bringing strangers into my home and telling them it belongs to the family. What's wrong is violating my privacy and then playing the victim when you get caught. The conversation ended with Frank ordering me to leave his house until I was ready to apologize to Sarah for my heartless behavior. Linda accused me of letting wealth corrupt my values and demanded that I remove the security cameras immediately as a gesture of trust toward my sister. If you can't trust your own family, then you don't deserve to have a family, she said as she walked me to the door. I drove home feeling emotionally drained and completely isolated. The people who were supposed to love and support me unconditionally had turned against me for defending my own property and privacy. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, but I also felt a strange kind of relief. At least now I knew exactly where everyone stood. What I didn't know was that my parents had been planning their next move long before our confrontation. 3 days later, Frank called to inform me that they'd consulted with an attorney about my unreasonable behavior regarding the villa. We've been advised that you may be in breach of certain family obligations, he said in a formal tone I'd never heard from him before. The lawyer says there might be grounds for legal action if you continue to exclude Sarah from access to the property. What family obligations? It's my house, Dad. I bought it with my own money. Money you earned using advantages we provided through your upbringing and education. Plus, there are documented promises you made about sharing the property with family members. I never made any such promises. Our attorney has evidence that suggests otherwise. We think it's time to settle this matter through proper legal channels. The phone call ended with Frank informing me that I'd be receiving official legal documents within the week. I spent the weekend researching family property law, trying to understand what possible case they could have against me. Nothing I found suggested that parents had any legal claim to their adult children's real estate purchases. The lawsuit papers arrived by certified mail on Christmas morning. The timing was clearly intentional, designed to maximize the psychological impact of being served legal documents on a holiday traditionally associated with family harmony and love. The lawsuit was more extensive and vindictive than I'd imagined possible. William Steinberg, the attorney my parents had hired, specialized in family property disputes and had a reputation for aggressive tactics in pursuing financial settlements. His legal brief painted me as a manipulative son who'd systematically exploited his family's emotional and financial support to build wealth, then reneged on promises to share that success with his struggling sister. According to the lawsuit, I had verbally agreed during multiple family gatherings to provide Sarah with permanent access to the villa as a live work space for her artistic pursuits. The legal documents included detailed descriptions of conversations that allegedly took place during holiday dinners, birthday celebrations, and casual family visits over the past 2 years. The lawsuit claimed that my parents and Sarah had made significant financial and emotional investments based on these promises. Sarah had allegedly turned down other housing opportunities and career prospects in anticipation of moving into the villa's guest quarters. Linda and Frank claimed they'd refinance their own home to help support Sarah's art career, expecting that she'd soon have stable housing at my property. Most shocking was the demand for damages. They weren't just seeking access to the house. They wanted full ownership transferred to Sarah, plus compensation for emotional distress, lost opportunities, and legal expenses. The total amount demanded was over $6 million, essentially the entire value of my property, plus punitive damages. Steinberg had also included a character assassination disguised as supporting evidence. The brief described me as someone who'd always been manipulative and self-centered, using family connections for personal gain while maintaining a facade of generosity. It referenced the medical loan for Sarah's surgery as an example of how I'd grudgingly provided minimal help while living in luxury myself. The legal strategy was clear. Portray me as a wealthy tech executive who'd abandoned his family obligations and broken sacred promises made to vulnerable relatives. In a family court setting with the right judge and compelling testimony, it was exactly the kind of case that could generate significant sympathy for the plaintiffs. Reading through the lawsuit felt like being punched in the stomach repeatedly. These people knew me better than anyone in the world, and they'd used that intimate knowledge to craft the most damaging possible narrative about my character and motivations. Every private conversation, every family moment, every gesture of generosity had been twisted into evidence of manipulation and betrayal. The timing of the lawsuit also revealed the depth of their planning. Christmas morning service meant I'd spend the holiday alone, processing the devastating reality that my own parents were trying to steal my home through legal fraud. It was psychological warfare designed to break my spirit before the case even reached trial. Marcus found me that evening sitting on my deck staring at the ocean while the legal papers scattered in the wind around my feet. He'd been trying to call me all day, worried, when I didn't show up for our planned holiday dinner. "They're actually suing you," he asked after reading through Steinberg's brief. "Your own parents are trying to take your house through the courts. They claim I promised it to Sarah. They say the whole family made sacrifices based on that promise." "That's complete nonsense, and you know it. You worked your tail off for this place. They didn't contribute a single dollar toward the purchase." "It doesn't matter what's true," I said, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. "It matters what they can convince a judge is true, and they've had months to prepare their version of events." Marcus spent an hour trying to convince me to hire the best attorney money could buy, but I was beyond rational decision-making. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't think clearly about strategy or defense. My own family had declared war on me, and I felt utterly defeated before the battle had even begun. The local media picked up the story within days of the lawsuit being filed. "Tech executive sued by family over Malibu mansion" became the headline that defined my public image for weeks. The coverage was uniformly negative, painting me as a greedy son who'd forgotten his roots and abandoned his struggling family. The comment sections on news websites were brutal. Strangers who knew nothing about my situation except what they'd read in biased articles condemned me as everything wrong with tech culture and American inequality. I became a symbol of selfish success, the wealthy brother who couldn't spare a room for his artistic sister. The court date was set for 3 months away, giving both sides time to prepare their cases and gather evidence. What I didn't realize was that Steinberg and my parents were using that time for more than legal preparation. They were orchestrating a coordinated campaign of manipulation and false testimony that would make their previous deceptions look like innocent misunderstandings. The real battle was just beginning, and I was walking into it completely alone. The weeks following Christmas were the darkest period of my adult life. I'd lost my family, my public reputation was in ruins, and I was facing a legal battle that could cost me everything I'd worked to achieve. Most nights I sat alone in my villa staring at the ocean and wondering how my success had turned into such complete isolation. Marcus tried to maintain my morale, but even he was struggling to understand the situation. "You need to fight this thing," he kept saying. "You need the best lawyer in California and a strategy to expose their lies." "Why, what's the point?" I'd respond. "Even if I win, I've still lost my family forever. And if I lose, I've got nothing left anyway. The turning point came in early February when Marcus brought me a business card for Janet Walsh Investigations. My cousin used her services during his divorce, he explained. She's former FBI, specializes in family financial fraud. If anyone can figure out what your parents are really up to, it's her. Janet Walsh was not what I'd expected from a private investigator. She was 45 years old, professionally dressed, and spoke with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex criminal cases. Her office in downtown Los Angeles was lined with commendations from law enforcement agencies and thank you letters from clients. Family litigation involving significant property always has hidden layers. One iniuition, she explained during our first meeting. People don't usually risk destroying relationships over housing arrangements unless there are deeper financial motivations involved. I hired her on the spot, desperate for someone who could make sense of the chaos my life had become. Walsh requested copies of all legal documents, family financial records I could access, and detailed timelines of every interaction I'd had with my parents and Sarah over the past 2 years. "Mom, I'm going to investigate this case as if it were a white-collar crime," she told me, "because based on what you've described, that's exactly what it is." Walsh's investigation began with public record searches and financial database queries that revealed information I never could have accessed on my own. Within a week, she'd uncovered discrepancies in my parents' financial situation that explained much of their desperation. Linda and Frank's modest Torrance home was heavily mortgaged, with 3 separate loans against the property totaling more than its market value. They'd been making interest-only payments for the past 18 months, barely avoiding foreclosure, through a series of refinancing arrangements that were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. "Your parents are essentially underwater on their house," Walsh explained during our second meeting. "They owe more than they could possibly recover if they sold the property. That's why they need a significant cash infusion to avoid losing everything." The investigation revealed a pattern of financial desperation stretching back nearly 3 years. Frank had been making regular trips to local casinos, initially small amounts, but escalating to weekend gambling binges that consumed hundreds of dollars at a time. Linda knew about the gambling and had been covering the losses by taking cash advances on credit cards and borrowing against their home's declining equity. "Wusao, gambling addiction often escalates gradually," Walsh noted as she showed me bank statements and casino transaction records. "Your father probably started with $20 bets and convinced himself he could win back his losses with bigger gambles. It's a classic pattern that destroys families financially." More disturbing was the discovery that my parents had been systematically damaging Sarah's credit and financial standing without her knowledge. They'd opened credit cards in her name, used her social security number for loan applications, and listed her as a co-signer on debt obligations she'd never agreed to take on. "Your sister is as much a victim of their financial fraud as you are," Walsh explained. "She probably doesn't even know that her credit has been destroyed by accounts she never opened." The anonymous tip Walsh arranged for Sarah was delivered through a credit monitoring service that alerted her to suspicious activity on her financial records. When Sarah called the credit reporting agencies to investigate, she discovered thousands of dollars in debt attributed to accounts she'd never opened or authorized. Sarah's confrontation with our parents was explosive, according to Walsh's surveillance of their Torrance home. The screaming match lasted for over an hour, with Sarah accusing Linda and Frank of stealing her identity and destroying her future prospects. The response from our parents was to convince Sarah that I was somehow responsible for the credit fraud, using my influence in the tech industry to frame them for financial crimes. "They're remarkably skilled manipulators," Walsh observed. "Even when caught red-handed, they managed to redirect your sister's anger toward you rather than accepting responsibility for their own actions." The deeper Walsh dug into the case, the more evidence she uncovered of long-term planning and premeditation. Steinberg had been consulting with my parents for over a year before they filed the lawsuit, developing strategies to claim ownership of my property through various legal theories. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to family conflict, Walsh reported. They've been planning to take your house since the day you bought it. Everything else, the guilt campaigns, the manipulation, the false medical emergency, was preparation for this legal assault. Most damaging to my parents' case was Walsh's discovery of recorded conversations between them and Steinberg discussing how to fabricate evidence and coordinate false testimony. The recordings were obtained through legal surveillance of Steinberg's office, where Walsh had placed listening devices with the help of a cleaning service employee. They're planning to lie under oath about conversations that never happened, Walsh explained as we listened to the recordings in her office. Steinberg is coaching them on how to present false testimony in a way that sounds credible to a family court judge. The recordings revealed the calculated nature of their deception. Linda and Frank had been rehearsing stories about promised shared ownership of the villa, practicing responses to potential cross-examination questions, and coordinating their testimony to support each other's false claims. Your mother is particularly good at emotional manipulation, Walsh noted. Listen to how she practices crying on command while describing your alleged promises to give Sarah the house. Even more disturbing was their discussion of my childhood and adolescence, twisting normal family interactions into evidence of manipulative behavior on my part. They were planning to testify that I'd always been selfish and controlling, using specific examples from my teenage years taken completely out of context. They're going to claim that your academic success was achieved by manipulating teachers and administrators, Walsh summarized, after listening to hours of recorded conversations. According to their prepared testimony, you've always been someone who uses other people for personal gain. The final piece of evidence was the most shocking discovery of Walsh's investigation. 3 days before the scheduled trial, she intercepted communications between Steinberg and a document forger who'd been hired to create backdated family agreements supposedly signed during holiday gatherings. They were planning to present forged evidence in court, Walsh explained. Fake contracts claiming that you'd legally committed to sharing ownership of the villa with Sarah. The signatures looked remarkably similar to your actual handwriting. Walsh's investigation had uncovered a conspiracy involving financial fraud, identity theft, planned perjury, and document forgery. What had appeared to be a family dispute over property ownership was actually an elaborate criminal scheme designed to steal my home through legal manipulation and false testimony. This case isn't about family obligations or broken promises, Walsh concluded. It's about desperate people committing serious crimes to avoid losing everything they own to gambling debts and poor financial decisions. Armed with this evidence, I finally understood the scope of what I was facing. My parents weren't misguided relatives seeking fairness for a struggling daughter. They were criminals willing to destroy their entire family to cover their financial crimes and steal my property. The betrayal was complete, but at least now I knew the truth about what I was fighting against. The question was whether I could present this evidence effectively in court without a lawyer, and whether Judge Patricia Manning would be willing to listen to the truth despite the emotional manipulation my parents were prepared to deploy. With less than a month before the trial, I made the decision that would define the entire case. I was going to represent myself. Marcus thought I'd lost my mind. Walsh strongly advised against it. And every legal expert I consulted warned me that going up against William Steinberg without professional representation was professional suicide. You're not just fighting your parents, Marcus argued during one of our late-night strategy sessions. You're going up against a shark who's made a career out of destroying people in family court. He knows every trick, every manipulation tactic, every way to make you look bad in front of a judge. That's exactly why I have to do this myself, I replied, spreading Walsh's evidence across my dining room table like pieces of a complex puzzle. This isn't just a legal case, it's personal. They used their intimate knowledge of me to create lies and manipulation. I need to respond with the same level of personal investment. The truth was, I couldn't bear the thought of hiring an attorney to fight my own family. Despite everything they'd done, these were still the people who'd raised me, taught me right from wrong, and shaped my understanding of loyalty and integrity. Having a stranger argue against my parents in court felt like the final destruction of any possibility for family reconciliation. I spent 3 weeks learning everything I could about family court procedures, property law, and rules of evidence. My home office became a law library with legal textbooks, case precedents, and procedural manuals stacked on every available surface. I watched hours of courtroom footage online studying how successful self-represented litigants presented their cases and cross-examined witnesses. Walsh helped me organize the evidence into a coherent narrative that exposed the financial desperation motivating my parents' lawsuit. The gambling records, mortgage documents, and credit fraud evidence painted a clear picture of people willing to commit serious crimes to avoid losing their home. The key is presenting this information in the right order, Walsh advised. Start with their financial situation to establish motive, then move to the evidence of fraud and manipulation. Save the recorded conversations for last. They're your smoking gun. The most challenging aspect of preparation was learning to cross-examine my own family members. I practiced with Walsh playing different roles, but nothing could prepare me for the emotional reality of questioning people I'd loved and trusted my entire life. Your mother will try to make you look heartless, Walsh warned. She'll cry. She'll talk about sacrifices she made for your education. She'll paint herself as a devoted parent betrayed by an ungrateful child. You have to stay focused on the facts and not let her emotional manipulation derail your questions. Frank would be different, but equally difficult. Your father will present himself as the reasonable voice of family responsibility. He'll talk about traditional values, the importance of taking care of family members, and how success comes with obligations to help those less fortunate. You need to be prepared for that narrative. Sarah would be the most heartbreaking witness to face. Your sister genuinely believes she deserves the house, Walsh reminded me. In her mind, your success should automatically translate to her benefit. She's not necessarily lying when she testifies. She's expressing what she truly thinks is fair. 3 days before the trial, Walsh delivered the package that would change everything. Audio recordings of my parents and Steinberg discussing their planned false testimony. The conversations were devastating, revealing not just their intention to lie under oath, but their casual attitude toward destroying my reputation and relationships. Listen to this part, Walsh said, playing a particularly damaging section where Linda practiced fake emotional breakdown while describing fictional conversations where I'd allegedly promised to share the villa. That's Oscar-worthy performance? Frank's voice responded on the recording. If you can sell that in court, the judge will think Arlo is the most heartless son who ever lived. The beauty of family court is that it's all about emotions and relationships, Steinberg's voice added. Judges want to protect vulnerable family members from wealthy relatives who've lost touch with their values. We just need to position you as the caring parents and Arlo as the greedy son who forgot where he came from. The recordings were legally obtained and would be admissible as evidence, but presenting them effectively would require perfect timing. I decided to save them for the cross-examination phase after my parents had committed to their false testimony under oath. The weekend before the trial, I received an unexpected visitor. Sarah appeared at my door on Saturday evening looking exhausted and emotionally drained from weeks of family conflict and financial stress. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. "I need to talk to you about something." We sat in my living room, overlooking the ocean, the same space where she'd brought strangers during her unauthorized visits. For the first time in months, we talked like siblings, rather than adversaries sharing our different perspectives on the family crisis that had consumed our lives. "I found out about the credit cards," she said after an hour of careful conversation. "Janet Walsh was right. They've been using my name on debt applications for years. My credit score is completely destroyed. I'm sorry, Sarah. I had no idea they were doing that to you too. I confronted them about it, and they said you were behind the credit fraud. They claimed you were trying to frame them using your tech connections. She paused, studying my face for any sign of deception. But that doesn't make sense, does it? Why would you destroy my credit just to make them look bad? I wouldn't. I've never accessed your financial records or interfered with your credit in any way. Sarah sat quietly for several minutes processing the implications of what she was learning. If they lied about that, what else have they lied about? I showed her some of Walsh's evidence. The gambling records, the mortgage documents, the bandertier, the evidence of financial desperation that explained their motivation for the lawsuit. Sarah's reaction was heartbreaking to watch the gradual realization that our parents had been manipulating and using both of us to cover their own financial crimes. They really need money that badly? She asked, staring at the bank statements showing Frank's casino losses. They're about to lose their house, Sarah. The gambling debts and mortgage payments are more than they can handle on their retirement income. They need a major cash infusion or they'll lose everything. And they thought they could get that by taking your house. That's what the evidence suggests. Sarah left that evening without making any commitments about the trial, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. The absolute certainty she'd felt about deserving the villa was being replaced by questions about whether our parents had been honest with her about anything. The final piece of preparation was the most difficult. Accepting that whatever happened in court, my relationship with my family would never be the same. Win or lose the trial would expose lies, manipulation, and betrayal that couldn't be undone or forgiven easily. Marcus stayed with me the night before the trial, both of us too nervous to sleep. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as we watched the sunrise over the Pacific from my deck. "I don't think anyone can be ready to fight their own family in court," I replied. "But I'm ready to tell the truth and let the judge decide what justice looks like. You've got the evidence, you know the law, and you're fighting for what's right. That has to count for something." As I drove to the courthouse that morning carrying boxes of evidence and legal documents in my car, I felt a strange combination of terror and relief. The months of manipulation, guilt, and betrayal were finally going to be exposed in a forum where truth mattered more than emotional manipulation. I was walking into the biggest fight of my life, armed with nothing but facts and the hope that justice would prevail over family politics and calculated deception. The Malibu courthouse was more intimidating than I'd expected, an imposing structure of glass and stone that seemed designed to humble anyone seeking justice within its walls. Local news crews had gathered outside, turning my personal family crisis into public entertainment for the morning television audience. I walked through the crowd of reporters and curiosity seekers carrying 2 boxes of evidence, wearing my best suit and trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Inside the courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, with wooden benches that reminded me of church pews and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. Judge Patricia Manning entered at exactly 9 o'clock, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every variety of human deception during her decades on the bench. She reviewed the case files briefly before addressing both sides. "This is a family property dispute involving significant financial assets," she began in a voice that commanded immediate attention. "I expect all parties to conduct themselves with dignity and respect regardless of the personal emotions involved. Mr. Steinberg, you may present your opening statement." Steinberg rose from his table with the confident swagger of a man who'd destroyed families for profit countless times before. He was everything I'd expected from Walsh's descriptions. Expensive suit, perfect hair, and the kind of practiced charm that concealed ruthless calculation. "Your Honor, this case is about broken promises and family betrayal." He began, his voice carrying just the right note of moral indignation. Arlo Torres used his family's emotional and financial support to build a successful career, then abandoned his obligations to the people who made his success possible. He painted a picture of Linda and Frank as devoted parents who'd sacrificed their own comfort to support my education and career development. According to Steinberg's narrative, they'd refinanced their home multiple times to help pay for my college expenses and provided emotional support during my difficult years as a struggling entrepreneur. In return for these sacrifices, Mr. Torres made repeated promises to share his good fortune with his family, particularly his sister Sarah, who has struggled to establish her artistic career. These weren't casual comments. They were specific commitments made during family gatherings, documented by multiple witnesses. Steinberg described Sarah as a talented artist whose potential had been stifled by financial instability and lack of proper workspace. The villa, with its ocean views and spacious rooms, represented not just housing, but the creative environment she needed to flourish professionally. Mr. Torres has systematically excluded his sister from access to property he explicitly promised to share, violating the trust and good faith that form the foundation of family relationships. His parents seek justice not just for Sarah, but for the principle that success comes with responsibility to those who helped make it possible. The opening statement was masterfully crafted, hitting every emotional note that would resonate with a family court judge. Steinberg made me sound like a stereotypical tech executive who'd lost touch with his values and abandoned his family obligations in pursuit of material wealth. When my turn came, I stood slowly and approached the bench with my notes, acutely aware that I was about to represent myself against one of California's most successful family law attorneys. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and my own family members who were there to testify against me. Your Honor, this case is not about family obligations or broken promises. I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected. It's about financial fraud, identity theft, and systematic deception designed to steal property through false testimony and forged documents. I outlined the evidence Walsh had discovered: the gambling debts, mortgage problems, and credit card fraud that revealed my parents' true financial situation. I explained how their desperation had motivated them to orchestrate an elaborate scheme to claim ownership of property they'd never contributed to purchasing. The evidence will show that my parents have been planning this lawsuit for over a year, consulting with attorneys about strategies to claim my property and coordinating false testimony about conversations that never occurred. They've committed serious crimes in pursuit of this goal, including identity theft against my sister and plans to present forged documents as evidence. I kept my opening statement brief and factual, avoiding emotional appeals, in favor of promising concrete evidence that would expose the truth. Judge Manning listened attentively, taking notes and occasionally glancing toward my parents' table with an expression I couldn't interpret. Linda was called as the first witness, and her performance was everything Walsh had predicted it would be. She testified about the sacrifices she and Frank had made to support my education, describing herself as a devoted mother who'd always put her children's needs before her own comfort. We refinanced our house twice to help pay for Arlo's college expenses, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. We wanted him to have every opportunity to succeed, even if it meant financial hardship for us. According to Linda's testimony, I'd made explicit promises during multiple family gatherings to provide Sarah with living space at the villa. These promises had been made in front of numerous family members and formed the basis for Sarah's career planning and life decisions. He said the house was too big for one person and that Sarah should consider it her home, too. Linda testified, her voice breaking with practiced emotion. We made financial commitments based on those promises, believing that Arlo would honor his word to help his sister. Steinberg guided Linda through detailed descriptions of family dinners, holiday celebrations, and casual conversations where I'd allegedly committed to sharing the property. The testimony was convincing because it included enough accurate details about real family gatherings to sound credible, even though the conversation she described had never actually occurred. Frank's testimony followed a similar pattern, presenting himself as a reasonable father, concerned about his children's well-being and financial security. He described me as someone who'd changed dramatically after achieving success, becoming materialistic and disconnected from family values. Success went to his head, Frank testified solemnly. The son we raised to value family and sharing became someone who cared more about possessions than people. When we reminded him of his promises to help Sarah, he became hostile and defensive. According to Frank, the lawsuit was a last resort after months of trying to resolve the situation through family discussions. They'd hoped I would honor my commitments voluntarily, but my refusal to cooperate had forced them to seek legal intervention. Sarah's testimony was the most difficult to watch because her pain and confusion were genuine, even though her understanding of the situation was completely wrong. She described years of financial struggle as an artist living in cramped apartments and struggling to afford basic art supplies while watching me live in luxury. I thought family was supposed to help each other, she said through tears that weren't performed like our mother's. When Arlo promised I could use part of the house as a studio, it felt like a miracle. Finally, I could focus on my art without worrying about rent every month. Sarah's testimony included detailed descriptions of conversations where I'd allegedly invited her to consider the villa her second home. She spoke about planning her art career around the assumption that she'd have access to proper studio space, and how my eventual refusal to honor those commitments had devastated her emotionally and financially. Steinberg concluded the plaintiff's case by presenting what he claimed were handwritten family agreements documenting my promises to share the property. The documents looked official and included signatures that resembled my handwriting, though I knew I'd never signed anything of the kind. These agreements represent the defendant's own acknowledgement of his family obligations, Steinberg argued. They confirm the testimony you've heard about promises made and commitments broken. When my turn came to present evidence, I started with the financial records that exposed my parents' true situation. Bank statements, mortgage documents, and casino transaction records painted a clear picture of people facing financial ruin due to gambling addiction and poor decisions. The plaintiffs aren't seeking justice for broken family promises, I explained to Judge Manning. They're seeking money to cover gambling debts and avoid losing their house to foreclosure. This entire lawsuit is motivated by financial desperation, not family obligations. I presented evidence of the credit card fraud my parents had committed using Sarah's identity, showing how they'd systematically destroyed her credit while claiming to act in her best interests. The credit reports and unauthorized account statements were undeniable proof of identity theft that had been ongoing for years. My sister is as much a victim of this fraud as I am, I testified. She didn't know her parents had been opening accounts in her name and damaging her credit to cover their own financial problems. The handwriting analysis of the supposed family agreements revealed clear evidence of forgery. Expert testimony showed that while the signatures looked similar to my handwriting, they'd been created by someone studying samples of my actual signature and attempting to reproduce it. These documents were created specifically for this lawsuit, I explained. They're not genuine agreements, but forged evidence designed to support false testimony about conversations that never occurred. Judge Manning examined the handwriting evidence carefully, comparing the forged signatures to authentic samples of my writing from various legal documents. The differences were subtle but detectable, particularly in the way certain letters were formed and connected. When I began cross-examining my father about the family's financial situation, the facade he'd maintained during his direct testimony began to crumble. Frank tried to minimize the gambling losses, at first claiming they were occasional entertainment expenses that had been taken out of context. These casino transactions show regular visits over a period of 2 years. I said, presenting bank statements with highlighted withdrawals. The total amount exceeds $40,000. That's not occasional entertainment, that's a gambling addiction. Frank's composure broke as I continued questioning him about the mortgage problems, refinancing arrangements, and mounting debt that threatened their home ownership. He began crying as he admitted that they were facing foreclosure and desperately needed money to avoid losing everything they'd worked for during their marriage. "We just need help, son," he pleaded from the witness stand, abandoning his prepared testimony in favor of raw emotional appeal. "We're your parents. We raised you, supported you, believed in you when nobody else did. Doesn't that count for something?" "It counts for everything, Dad," I replied quietly. "But it doesn't give you the right to steal my house through perjury and fraud." Judge Manning called a recess at that point, clearly sensing that the case had taken a dramatic turn from family property dispute to criminal fraud investigation. During the break, I saw Sarah talking intensely with Linda and Frank in the hallway. Their voices raised in what appeared to be a heated argument about everything that had been revealed. When court resumed, I presented the final piece of evidence that would destroy any remaining credibility my parents might have maintained. The audio recordings of their conversations with Steinberg were devastating, exposing not just their planned perjury, but their casual attitude toward destroying my reputation and relationships. "The evidence will speak for itself, Your Honor," I said as I activated the digital audio player connected to the courtroom sound system. The recorded voices of Linda, Frank, and Steinberg filled the courtroom, discussing strategies for fabricating evidence and coordinating false testimony. Judge Manning's expression grew increasingly stern as she listened to them rehearsing lies about family conversations that had never occurred. "Your mother is particularly good at emotional manipulation," Steinberg's recorded voice advised. "If she can cry on command while describing Arlo's broken promises, the judge will see him as a heartless son who abandoned his struggling family." The most damaging recording captured Linda practicing her fake emotional breakdown, while Frank coached her on specific details to include in her false testimony. "Remember to mention how we sacrificed our retirement savings to support his education," Frank's voice instructed. "That makes it sound like he owes us for his success." Steinberg tried to object to the recordings as illegally obtained evidence, but I was able to demonstrate that Walsh's investigation had followed all proper legal procedures for surveillance and evidence gathering. Judge Manning ruled the recordings admissible and listened to them in their entirety, her disapproval of the plaintiff's conduct becoming more obvious with each revelation. When the recordings ended, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of Sarah crying softly in the front row. She'd finally understood the full scope of how our parents had manipulated and used both of us to cover their financial crimes and personal failures. "Mr. Steinberg," Judge Manning said in a voice that could have frozen water, "I've been presiding over family court cases for 15 years, and I have never encountered such a blatant attempt to defraud the court through perjury and forged evidence. I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation." The trial was essentially over at that point, though Steinberg made a desperate attempt to argue that the financial evidence didn't invalidate his client's claims about family promises. Judge Manning cut him off before he could complete his argument. "This court will not be a party to rewarding fraud and perjury," she declared firmly. "The case is dismissed with prejudice, and the defendants will be responsible for all court costs incurred by Mr. Torres in defending against these false claims." As I packed my evidence boxes and prepared to leave the courtroom, I felt a complex mixture of vindication, exhaustion, and profound sadness. I'd won the legal battle and protected my property, but the cost had been the complete destruction of my family relationships and the public exposure of my parents as criminals willing to commit serious crimes for financial gain. The real question was whether any healing would be possible after such devastating revelations about the people who'd raised me to value honesty and integrity above all else. The aftermath of the trial was chaos that took months to resolve. Local news coverage focused on the dramatic courtroom revelations with headlines about family fraud scheme exposed and parents' attempt to steal son's mansion through perjury. The story became a cautionary tale about gambling addiction and family manipulation that was discussed on talk shows and social media for weeks. William Steinberg faced immediate disciplinary action from the California State Bar for his role in presenting forged evidence and coaching false testimony. His law license was suspended pending a full investigation into his professional conduct, effectively ending his career as a family law attorney. The district attorney's office opened criminal cases against my parents for fraud, perjury, and identity theft that could have resulted in serious prison time. But the most important conversation happened 3 days after the trial, when Sarah appeared at my villa unannounced, carrying a single canvas and looking emotionally drained from everything that had been revealed in court. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly, and I invited her into the living room where we'd had our last honest conversation months earlier. "I need to apologize." She began setting her canvas against the wall and sitting across from me with tears in her eyes. "I believed everything they told me about you promising me this house. I genuinely thought you were being selfish and cruel when you refused to let me live here." "You were manipulated, Sarah. They lied to both of us." "But I should have questioned it. I should have asked you directly instead of just accepting their version of events. I let my jealousy and financial desperation blind me to what was really happening." We talked for hours that afternoon, sharing our different perspectives on the family crisis and gradually rebuilding the trust that had been destroyed by months of manipulation and legal warfare. Sarah showed me the painting she'd brought, a seascape inspired by the view from my deck painted from memory during the weeks when she wasn't allowed to visit. "I painted this to remind myself of what it felt like to have hope," she explained. "Even when everything was falling apart, I could remember standing on your balcony and feeling like my art career might actually be possible someday." The conversation eventually turned to our parents and the criminal charges they were facing. Linda and Frank had been arrested the day after the trial, released on bail pending formal charges for fraud and perjury. They faced potential prison sentences that could destroy what remained of their retirement years. "I know they did terrible things," Sarah said carefully, "but they're still our parents. They raised us, loved us in their own imperfect way, and made sacrifices for our education and opportunities." "I've been thinking about that too," I replied. "The people who taught me right from wrong ended up doing something completely wrong to avoid the consequences of their own mistakes." That evening, I made the decision that would define how our family moved forward from the crisis. Instead of allowing the criminal cases to proceed to trial, I contacted the district attorney's office and offered to pay restitution for my parents' crimes in exchange for reduced charges that wouldn't result in prison time. The negotiation took several weeks, but eventually we reached an agreement that satisfied everyone involved. Linda and Frank pleaded guilty to fraud charges and received probation instead of prison sentences, with the condition that they enter gambling addiction treatment and financial counseling programs. I paid their outstanding debts, including the mortgage problems that had motivated their desperation, in exchange for their agreement to stay away from me while they worked on recovery. "You're saving them from destroying their lives completely," the prosecutor explained during our final meeting. "Prison would have been devastating for people their age, but this gives them a chance to get help for the underlying problems that caused their criminal behavior." The financial cost was significant, nearly $800,000 to cover their debts, legal fees, and court-ordered restitution. But the emotional cost of watching my parents go to prison would have been far greater. And this solution offered the possibility of eventual family reconciliation once they'd addressed their addiction and dishonesty problems. Sarah moved into a modest apartment in Santa Monica, that I helped her secure close enough to maintain our rebuilt relationship, but far enough to give both of us space to heal from the trauma of the lawsuit. She enrolled in art therapy sessions to process the guilt and manipulation she'd experienced, while also taking business courses to develop practical skills for supporting herself financially. "I don't want to be dependent on anyone else for my success," she explained. "If I'm going to make it as an artist, it needs to be because of my own talent and hard work, not because of family connections or manipulated opportunities." The transformation in our family dynamics was gradual but profound. Linda and Frank spent 6 months in intensive therapy addressing not just Frank's gambling addiction, but the patterns of manipulation and entitlement that had enabled their criminal behavior. The family counseling sessions were difficult but necessary, forcing all of us to confront how our relationships had been built on unhealthy expectations and poor communication. "We taught you that success comes with obligations to take care of family members," Linda admitted during one particularly emotional session. "But we never taught you that those obligations have to be voluntary and reasonable. We confused love with financial support." Frank's recovery from gambling addiction was harder to watch than I'd expected. The man who'd raised me to value honesty and integrity had to confront the reality that he'd been living a double life for years, lying to his family while destroying their financial security through compulsive gambling. "I convinced myself that I could win back everything I'd lost," he explained during a family session after 4 months of treatment. "Each bet was going to be the one that fixed all our problems. Instead, each bet made everything worse until I was willing to commit crimes to cover up my failures." The healing process wasn't linear or simple. There were setbacks, arguments, and moments when I questioned whether reconciliation was possible or even advisable. But gradually, we began to rebuild relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation, support rather than obligation. Sarah's art career began to flourish once she was free from the financial desperation and family pressure that had been stifling her creativity. She received her first major commission 6 months after the trial, a series of ocean landscapes for a new hotel in Santa Barbara. The payment was enough to establish a small emergency fund and invest in proper art supplies for future projects. "I never realized how much the desperation was affecting my work," she told me while showing me photos of her latest paintings. "When you're constantly worried about money and living space, it's impossible to create anything authentic or meaningful." The villa itself became a symbol of transformation rather than division. I began hosting monthly family dinners on the deck, small gatherings where we practiced the honest communication and healthy boundaries we'd learned in therapy. Linda and Frank attended after completing their first year of treatment, nervous but genuine in their efforts to rebuild trust. "This house represents everything I worked for," I said during one of these dinners, watching the sunset over the Pacific while my family gathered around the table. "But it also represents the importance of earning rather than expecting, of building rather than taking." The legal resolution of the case brought unexpected professional benefits. My defense against the fraudulent lawsuit had attracted attention from other tech executives facing similar family pressures, and I began consulting with families about managing wealth and success in ways that strengthened rather than destroyed relationships. "Your case became a model for how to handle family financial manipulation," one client explained. "You showed that it's possible to love your family while still protecting yourself from their destructive behavior." Marcus, who'd supported me throughout the entire ordeal, was promoted to Chief Technology Officer at DataCorp, partly based on his loyalty and judgment during my legal crisis. Our friendship had been tested and strengthened by the challenges we'd faced together. "You could have handled this differently," he reflected one evening as we sat on the deck talking about everything that had happened. "You could have cut them off completely or let them go to prison. Instead, you found a way to get justice while still preserving the possibility of family relationships." The final resolution came during a family dinner exactly 1 year after the trial. Sarah arrived carrying a large canvas wrapped in brown paper, which she unveiled with obvious pride and nervous excitement. The painting was a masterpiece, a panoramic seascape capturing the view from my deck at sunset with layers of color and light that conveyed both the beauty and the complexity of the ocean's moods. In the foreground, she'd painted a family of seabirds, working together to build a nest on the cliff top, their cooperation in stark contrast to the powerful forces of nature around them. "I call it rebuilding," she explained as we all stared at the stunning artwork. "It's about finding ways to work together, despite the storms that try to tear us apart." Linda and Frank had tears in their eyes as they studied their daughter's work, finally understanding the talent and potential they'd been trying to exploit rather than nurture. The painting represented Sarah's emergence as a serious artist, but also our family's journey from manipulation and fraud toward honesty and mutual respect. "We're proud of you," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying none of the calculated manipulation that had characterized his words during the lawsuit. "We're proud of both of you. You've built something beautiful, despite all the mistakes we made along the way." As we sat together watching another spectacular Malibu sunset, I realized that the villa had become exactly what I'd always wanted it to be. Not a symbol of personal success that isolated me from family, but a gathering place where relationships could be built on truth rather than expectation. The legal battle had been devastating, but it had also cleared away years of accumulated resentment, manipulation, and dishonesty that had been poisoning our family dynamics. We were smaller now, more careful with trust, but also more genuine in our affection and support for each other. Success doesn't mean you owe your family your achievements, I reflected as the evening wound down. But it does mean you have the power to help them become their best selves, rather than enabling their worst impulses. Sarah's painting now hangs in my living room, a daily reminder that storms pass, but the work of rebuilding never really ends. Family relationships require constant attention, honest communication, and the courage to confront problems before they become crises. The villa remains my home, but it's no longer a fortress protecting me from family obligations. Instead, it's become a foundation for healthier relationships, built on mutual respect, voluntary support, and the understanding that love means helping each other grow rather than simply taking what we think we deserve. What challenges have you faced in balancing personal success with family expectations? How do you think families should handle conflicts over money and achievement? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if you found value in hearing about this journey from family crisis to healing. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming difficult relationships and building authentic connections with the people who matter most. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding how truth and boundaries can actually strengthen rather than destroy family bonds. Thank you for listening to this deeply personal story, and I hope it helps you navigate your own family challenges with wisdom and courage.